Hello and welcome to the podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and in this programme I'm talking to the writer Claire Launchbury about the devastating Grenfell Tower fire of June 2017, in which 72 people died, and its aftermath. More than 2 years after the fire, on the 30th of October this year, Sir Martin Moore-Bick published the report on Phase 1 of his official Grenfell Tower inquiry. This first phase focused on the events of the night of the fire itself, examining its cause, its spread, and the response to it. The report is critical of many aspects of the building, the emergency services coordination on the night of the fire, and their preparedness for a disaster on this scale. It also, significantly, described the suggestion that the external walls of the tower complied with building regulations. These stipulate that these walls should be able to resist the spread of fire, as an affront to common sense. The tower breached building regulations, the report concluded, which is significant as Phase 2 of the inquiry will look at the refurbishment of the tower, its management, and ultimate responsibility for the fire. Claire Launchbury, who's contributed an article entitled Grenfell's Untold Story to the December edition of the paper, is a writer who volunteered for a charity at the Clement James Centre in North Kensington, offering emotional support after the fire. Her article looks at the reactions and treatment of the Grenfell community since the fire, and their response to the inquiry process. Do they feel their voices have been heard? Whose narrative will prevail? When I spoke to Claire on the phone recently, I began by asking her to situate Grenfell Tower within the geography of present-day London.
It's a really, really interesting situation of Grenfell. So it's in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which is, I think, the wealthiest borough in the United Kingdom. And North Kensington, where the Lancaster West Estate sits, has got some of the poorest population in the United Kingdom in it. So side by side, you have the extreme wealth. For me, I think of Kensington as the Institut Français, the Lycée, the V&A, these big sort of cultural institutions, and of great wealth. And yet you have literally just next door to it a multicultural complex of social housing, an extremely wonderful convivial community that could not be more different from the population of the other bit of Kensington. So you have these two incredibly different parts of London absolutely side by side. When the fire happened, and you think of Kensington, it was the kind of in plain sightness. How was that possible in that borough there, in that part of West London, in this absolutely fantastically wealthy major capital city, major global city? What is going on? And I think a lot of people outside of the borough even, let alone outside London, don't quite appreciate or couldn't quite appreciate just how close those two different kinds of demographics were next to each other. And I think that's when you found the scandal of the neoliberal investment in London property, the empty houses next to a tower block of social housing, which had been for various, we can talk about that, for various political and social reasons, treated in a particular way, in a population that's treated in a particular way. The proximity of the two and the sort of inability of that divide to be crossed, I think, is a sort of psychological barrier about understanding that particular part of London.
And I guess that ties into one of the themes of your piece in Le Monde Diplomatique about the residents not having been listened to and having been deprived of agency, because it wasn't the case that no one there had contemplated the possibility of a fire and had warned about the possibility of the risk of a fire taking place, but they hadn't been listened to.
I think that's exactly the case. So the long history of the relationship between the Grenfell Action Group and the residents of Grenfell and the Borough Council, and in particular the arm's length tenant management organisation, are long, are complicated, and demonstrates a complete absence of listening on one side and the other. So Stuart Hodkinson, who wrote a very interesting book called Safe as Houses on the aftermath of Grenfell, outlines a lot of the political decisions that went into the way that social housing was run under New Labour, but also under the Conservative administration. And how, even though people were acutely aware and telling people that things weren't working in the refurbishment, that there was sort of air where there shouldn't be, there were power surges, that things were not right, nobody was listening. And there are things about how, when the fire took place, the records that the council held were 20 years out of date. And it's this curious, almost like a double bind of bureaucracy that you get with neoliberal administration, where you have this muddying of accountability because little bits of it are outsourced. And I think it's something like 380 different companies that were involved at some point in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. So drawing the lines of accountability, which is what the next stage of the inquiry is about, drawing direct lines of accountability becomes very, very difficult. And you have Arconic refusing to submit evidence, using a French law to not submit evidence to various points of legal analysis. But you also have a kind of the bureaucracy that's meant to protect people by keeping records of the people who live there, or by responding to the day-to-day existence of people's lives, responding to the fact that things mightn't be working, not functioning at all. So you have this sort of a kind of occluding bureaucracy that works for the advantage of those who don't want to take any responsibility for what they do, and then the people at the other end of that who trying to tell people and warn people that things are going wrong, not being listened to, and not having the mechanisms of ensuring that they're being listened to.
Now, you also emphasise in your piece the importance of narrative and who gets to tell their story and which version of the story is believed and gains currency and is sort of officially sanctioned and reproduced. Now, clearly, in the process of telling the story, the key process is the inquiry led by Sir Martin Moore-Bick, which has just produced the first phase report. So I know there was a lot of initial scepticism amongst the residents, and about whether that was going to deliver and ask questions and provide the answers that they wanted. So at this interim stage, can you say a little bit about what he's come back and said, and whether the residents are broadly in favour of how he's addressed his task?
I think, just to go back to your initial point about narrative, it was very quickly established that there was a kind of borough narrative, there was a residents narrative, and there was a newspaper, a media narrative that was, and many of them were sort of running out of control. I think for many of the people on the ground, being able to explain what happened to them, how their lives were affected by it, was incredibly important. And there was an awful lot of damage done by one particular journalist for the London Review of Books, which caused a great deal of hurt and meant that people felt betrayed by the role of somebody coming in and telling their story for them and then misrepresenting them. It's from that background, and also the mistrust of authority that goes along with having been ignored for many years, that they felt that the retired judge, Martin Moore-Bick, was very likely to uphold what they feared was going to be the establishment narrative, which didn't actually have the teeth to get to who was responsible for the people who, for the deaths of 72 people. And I think with this the first phase of the inquiry, the general sense is that they're reassured about the impartiality of it, that there is this very important point that he preempted the phase 2 of the inquiry by saying, actually, the cladding did not meet the building regulations. So there's no question of if there is responsibility. There is responsibility somewhere in the chain of command behind that refurbishment for what happened. So, and I think there's been, from that, in a different direction, a sense of activism that says, if this has happened here, they didn't listen to the lessons of Lakanal House, that we must be very active in drawing attention to other buildings with this kind of cladding, public or private. And so there's been a lot of collective activism from the Grenfell community outwards to ensure that no one else is ever in the situation that they were in. I think I call it, from Edward Said, this idea of the permission to narrate, who is absolutely a critical point for the community of those most affected by Grenfell to reassert their agency in what has been the most horrendous catastrophe for them.
And what do you make, Claire, of the decision to divide the inquiry into two parts with a two-part report, so that the first part focused on the night of the fire, and only in the second part would it really come on to the issues of the refurbishment and the management, and I guess the ultimate accountability? How was that decision received?
That decision was not received very well. I think there's a big sense that the inquiry is doing things back to front. So rather than starting from the decision-making process to who put the cladding up there, it's working backwards, which meant that it seemed like there's been a disproportionate focus on the actions of the fire brigade. Although I think it's important that they've seen there's a distinction between the people on the ground who risk their own lives in going in to save people in a structure that they didn't know much about, who, when their equipment wasn't up to scratch and all of that, as distinct from the management of London Fire Brigade. And that, I think, has been important. But it has meant, and I think the pernicious way that the report was leaked and then reported, residents still had signed their non-disclosure agreements and were unable to respond to things publicly, and that sort of sense that the narrative was being again taken away from them because it had been leaked to the Telegraph prior to its actual official release 2 or 3 days later. So there's a sense in which I think they feel it should have started differently. On the other hand, I think people understand why it was necessarily to go through sort of minute by minute the events of that night to see what was actually going on, with a disproportionate focus, it seems, on those who were there to save the lives rather than those that facilitated the means by which people were losing them.
In the last couple of weeks, the Tory MP Jacob Rees-Mogg said in a radio interview that he thought that common sense would dictate that you should leave a burning building. Do you think his remark actually says something quite profound about the state of Britain today and a sort of chasm that exists, and taps into some of the things that you say in your piece about agency and authority?
Absolutely. So I think, it was the most hideous, thoughtless thing to say in the first place, and anybody who I think checks himself for half a second would think, this is not something that you should be saying. And I think it says a lot about his own class and privilege, where people who tell you to leave a building are, people that work for you. They're not the people who are figures of authority necessarily. And I think there are issues around stay put, and this is something that John Preston has written about, and I draw on that in the article. But for people who had lived in that flat, they would have seen stay put notices as their fire advice every single day. So that's what you do. If there's a fire, you stay put. And had the building not failed and the cladding not failed in the way that it did, staying put would have been perfectly fine. So for him to say it was common sense was incredibly condescending. And also it just highlights the fact that for people who, as I say, to almost go back to the point about the immigration question, when you're an immigrant or if you're a refugee, your contact with authority is normally somebody checking who you are and whether you have the right to be somewhere. And refugees make really good citizens, really good law-abiding citizens, because they do not want to be noticed. Not for any, nefarious reason, but just, they follow the law. The kind of capital, the cultural capital that you would have needed to say, I'm not listening to those people, I'm not listening to those voices of authority, is massive. And you have a population there who I think there was a commentator on Twitter who, I can't remember who's in, he was involved in Grenfell in some way, and said if that had been Grenfell West 1 on the South Bank, there would have been sprinklers, there would have been an evacuation policy. You know, there is an absolutely contingent social aspect to the fact that people were not got out in the way that they would have been elsewhere. And I think it absolutely shows that. It shows that somebody who is born of privilege has not got a clue about the structural dynamics of people who aren't.
I was reading a piece in The Guardian at the weekend by Andy Beckett, who was saying that really with all the focus on Brexit, there's been remarkably little attention paid to the years of Tory rule that have just been. There's been little real examination of the failings of those Tory administrations that we've just lived through. And I wondered if you agreed that if we can call it normal times, there really would have been a great deal more attention paid to what Grenfell says about the wider state of inequality in this country, about social housing, about all the issues that you raise in your piece.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think and with great credit to the people at Inside Housing who have been absolutely persistent and diligent in their documenting of what has happened at Grenfell, and you know, determined to keep the evidence trail in the public arena alongside the inquiry. So that has been happening. But yeah, I mean, you only need to listen to Johnson's campaign, where you would, you know, in his narrative, he's only been PM for 120 days, and anything that went before that is really nothing to do with him, even though he is Foreign Secretary and in the government and Mayor of London. So the sliding away of responsibility for 9 years of Tory administration is quite egregious. The election isn't as Brexit focused as it might have been, and that's an incredibly important thing. But I do think that it has the divisions that referendum has caused and the referendum result has caused has absolutely meant that other things that have been happening, such as Grenfell, such as social housing, such as the right to social housing, which have been washed away in years of Tory austerity, have not been higher up in the agenda. And a lot of the Brexit stuff has been kind of whipping up some of the sentiments that result from that austerity, which is often anger and despair and turning against people who are different from you. So racism comes into it as well, rather than actually being upfront and honest about the fact that things could be better, and that state investment in things like housing is not a bad thing, that you know, providing safe accommodation for a population could perfectly well be a governmental responsibility that is of genuine benefit. So the Brexit issue has been incredibly damaging because of what it is, and secondly also because of the way it's overtaken or framed every other discussion that happens.
I guess we're sort of saying so far so good on the report in terms of Sir Martin Moore-Bick fulfilling his remit and asking difficult questions and not being afraid to come up with difficult conclusions. So even if we're saying so far so good, it's worth remembering, isn't it, that previous inquiries have returned recommendations, but those recommendations are not necessarily binding. So I was reading recently about, I think it was the Lakanal House fire, which recommended that plans of buildings should be available in the buildings for firefighters, and the government had rejected that recommendation as being excessive. So there's by no means a guarantee that when the final report is published that all the recommendations will actually be acted upon.
Absolutely. There was a push to insist that recommendations could come out at this stage, at the end of the first stage of the inquiry, and I think there is a process going on. Some recommendations have come out already because obviously the inquiry is such a long process, and making those things binding, I think, is, in the case of Grenfell, absolutely necessary, and it's one of the big questions that was asked. You had an inquiry about something previous or prior to the fire in Grenfell. why on earth wasn't that listened to? Why on earth wasn't that enacted? And the point that Stuart Hodkinson makes in his book on Safe as Houses is that the determination to get rid of the bureaucracy, to get rid of the red tape around planning laws from the Cameron administration, but it has some precedent actually in the previous one, was absolutely everywhere. And it goes back to that way of making things accountable, because you've got multiple companies, you've got people. Ben Ockery talks about the people who died in the profit margins. And I think that's exactly the case. And so where is the vested interest in not making recommendations into statute, into law? Who are the people who are stopping what should be self-evidently good from happening? And those questions are very critical politically for how we recover and stop something such as Grenfell from happening again. But how much regulatory teeth that are available. And I think so much from the Brexit referendum through to things that are happening currently, reports on Russian interference in the elections or whatever, show how difficult it is to actually regulate. The teeth of regulation, which should be there to protect all of us, have ways of just not working properly. And I think it's really important that is overcome. And I think through the second part, now that there is a suggestion that is absolutely, there is a responsibility for cladding which didn't meet the regulations, someone somewhere or people somewhere are going to have to go through some process of prosecution.
And here we are nearly 2.5 years after the fire, and it is the case, isn't it, that people will be going to bed tonight in the United Kingdom in buildings which are still clad with flammable materials.
Yeah. And it's an absolute disgrace. And you saw only recently there was a fire in the upper stories of a student accommodation building in Bolton, and that wasn't even cladding that comes under the revised remit post Grenfell. That was another form of cladding, and investigations are going on. And it was at 8:30 on a Saturday night, and full of young, very able-bodied people who could get out of building quickly. And I think there are cases where people have, they have a sort of a night watch, an informal guard that just keeps watch to check that nothing is happening. Or there's been reparations and people are finding themselves in a situation where houses that they bought on leasehold, I think it is, suddenly have completely, they're having to pay themselves as residents for the works to put the cladding right again, and subsequently have lost any kind of capital value in their homes effectively. So not only are they dangerous, they're also worthless. You've got this completely horrendous situation for people. Just from a laywoman's perspective, what on earth are you doing putting flammable cladding on a residential building?
When can we expect the second part of the report? The inquiry begins again in January, but how far off do we think it might be before we get the final conclusion?
I think it's going to be another couple of years, and that's literally just off the top of my head. These processes are incredibly slow, and I think it's already been too long for many people. And I know sort of some of the practical issues around the inquiry have improved. So it was in Holborn Chambers, and now they've moved it to Paddington, so somewhere closer to the Lancaster West estate, so people can get there more easily. Residents and people from the community who are interested can access it. But it's a shame it's going to take longer, because this is the critical bit where those responsible can actually finally come under some scrutiny. And the longer it is away from the event, the harder it is, I think, to hold people to account. And I think that's coming back to the sort of community activism on the ground. Those silent walks on the 14th of every month are really powerful in saying, we will not go away. This is a place where carnival happens, but we will walk through with silence. And it's a very powerful manifestation of the not being listened to. And it's now, you will observe us. We're not shouting, we're not protesting in a typical kind of manifestation or demonstration, it's a very powerful way of holding urban space and saying, look and remember.
I was talking to Claire Launchbury about her article Grenfell's Untold Story, which is published in the December 2019 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's also available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. And until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.